Everything rises and falls on leadership. The ability to lead well is fueled by living your cause and purpose. This podcast will equip you with the tools to do just that. Live and lead with cause and purpose. And now, author of the book, The Anatomy of Leadership, and our host, Chris Comeaux.
Hello and welcome. I'm excited. Happy 2026 to our listeners. Cordt Kassner, welcome. Top news stories of the month. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you so much. Great to be here, Chris, and welcome everyone who's listening. Appreciate it.
How was your holiday, man?
You know, it's fantastic. Christmas in Colorado is a beautiful thing. This year it was so warm. Family got together. We were out hiking, playing pickleball, just having a great time being together, and not so much skiing this year. It was really warm and beautiful. How about you? How was your Christmas and New Year's?
Yeah, mine was totally blessed. So we had a special circumstance. My son got married on January 3rd. Wow. So we had a really busy holiday. And then I came down with a flu during it. So that was kind of the unplanned portion of it. But we had a blessed Christmas, blessed New Year's Day. And then my son got married on the 3rd. And like you guys, it's so funny. I didn't go out and do it, but my son and my future son-in-law actually went and played pickleball. We have a really kind of nice driveway where we have a mobile pickleball court. Mm-hmm. They're like, we're going to play pickleball on Christmas. And they sure did, because it was warm. So it was a different Christmas from a weather standpoint. We got to spend some time out on our deck and just, like, I think it was in shorts, if I'm not mistaken. So it's pretty crazy in North Carolina to experience that in December. But it was really a blessed holiday. Thank you for asking.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, this is going to be one of our first shows in the new format where we're breaking our podcast into kind of a part 1 and part 2 to create more digestible pieces for folks. So the first part, you and I go over our top news stories of the month of December, and then really fun, we're going to get into reviewing our predictions from last year and then our predictions for 2026. So if you're ready, I'll jump into mine.
Looking forward to it. What do you have?
Yeah, so I actually had about 68 articles that were highlighted this month. So the highlighted Chris category, the ones that I want to cover. So there was an article in Forbes, Agentic AI in Digital Transformation, Why Autonomy Won't Fix the People and the Process Problems. And so there is I love this article because I think that leaders, sometimes we become panacea and are thinking about technology like it's going to fix all of our ills. Man, our current EMR sucks. We're going to go buy this new EMR and it's going to be perfect. And you don't think about the fact that it won't fix people and process problems. People and process problems, technology should be an accelerator because you fix those. You've got good processes and you apply technology as an accelerator. I've said before that I think it's the lost chapter of Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, another Colorado guy, Cordt. Yes. And so this is, to me, an article that was actually pointing that out and some things they were saying in it. The data is a mess. Leaders confuse buying with transforming. When you have no governance, it creates a problem. People are not ready in a lot of cases of how you're going to implement AI into processes that exists. Hype replaces strategy. And so it says agentic AI needs leadership, not just code. The best projects succeed not because of superior tools, but because the leaders behind them have clarity, courage, and communication skills. Again, great article, and I think a really good one. Start the year out. Next one was in Hospice News, Rehab to Death, bringing more palliative and hospice care to the SNFs. And so this just really reminded me, we have a great proposal that one of our members, Valley Hospice, Andrea Hill, the CEO, has come up with a SNF benefit, basically, a skilled level benefit for hospice. And we want to help her kind of promote it to the world because we see quite often these nursing facilities do choose skilled days. Quite often it's financials, and I'm not throwing them under the bus, but it's financial motivations. And then the families are like, oh, what's paying for the room and board? And we don't realize we truly are putting people through. I think we'll look back and say we've actually tortured seniors for a reimbursement model as opposed to what they really needed. So I thought that was a great article in Hospice News today.
That could be a great future podcast.
That's actually a really great idea. Medicare Advantage question hospitals won't answer. This was in Becker's. With Medicare Advantage enrollment approaching 55% of eligible beneficiaries, a little kind of teaser for my predictions later, I think that's actually going to be the high water mark, and we're going to start seeing it go down. Health systems across the country are grappling with a question that's gone largely unaddressed in policy circles. What happens if healthcare providers best equipped to care for seniors can no longer afford to participate and they do not participate in Medicare Advantage? What do you do if you don't have a hospital in your area that's not even part of a Medicare Advantage plan because they were like, I'm not going to contract with that actual Medicare Advantage plan? So I thought that was a really good article. Another one, Medicare's AI prior authorization pilot sparks backlash over incentives to deny care. Paradox of all paradoxes, right? Government's like, bad United Healthcare using AI for prior authorization. Oh, by the way, us and Medicare, we're going to pilot Medicare or Medicare Advantage, prior authorization via artificial intelligence. And so, but I do think that's actually going to be something really to watch this year because they are moving forward with that. I think some of the states where they're going to pilot is Arizona, New Jersey, Ohio, Oklahoma, Texas, and Washington throughout 2031. Another one, I love the title of this article, Volunteers Woven into the Fabric of Horizon Hospice and Palliative Care. And then you guys had a great editor's note on that one, Cordt, that I'll cite. Do you think your hospice volunteers are being woven into the fabric of the services you provide? There's not a program that we talk to that doesn't have staffing challenges. We're all dealing with the staffing challenges. Now, I remember I did a podcast with Judy Lynn Person right when she came out of her role at NHPCO, and now she's off on her own working with like MPHI. She works some with TCN. She freelances quite a bit. We titled that one Judy Lynn Person Unleashed. And my biggest aha listening to her was, first off, her background in volunteerism. And I think I asked her, what is that thing that's in the hospice COPs that maybe we might rediscover with fresh eyes? And this is what she pointed out was volunteers. And I love a title of an article that says, Volunteers Woven into the Fabric of Hospice and Palliative Care.
This was one of those articles that I looked at when I was reading it, and I thought, oh, that's Chris's program. Chris McFall, who runs Horizon Hospice in Spokane. And so I forwarded it to him. I said, hey, Chris, we're talking about this article and in the newsletter, just wanted to let you see it. And, I'm sure you've seen it, but let you know that we're spreading this across the country as well, because the same thing, it's a great word picture of being woven into the fabric of the hospice. So congratulations to the good folks at Horizon Hospice up in Spokane.
Yeah, that's what great articles do, right? They paint word pictures. Speaking of which, so our mutual friend, Dr. Byock in Health Affairs, did an article called Hospice, Heal Thyself. Really great, thought-provoking as always. Dr. Byock actually always, I think, provokes good thought. You'll use his framework in just a couple moments, but I love the fact that he's kind of keeping the conversation out there. Kudos to you. He actually did give me a heads up when the article went out. And one of the things that jumped out at me right away, just because I'm so acutely aware of the margins of a lot of our nonprofit providers, that it didn't have the most recent data. Kudos to you and Dr. Byock quickly jumping on that and making sure that you printed a retraction. The proper was the updated reflected figures from 2023 was margins of 13.7% for for-profits and negative 1.3% for nonprofits. So kudos for you guys for jumping on that. To me, it didn't detract from the power of what was in there, but I had a feeling some folks would probably go, wait, what? Especially the nonprofits who are experiencing those negative margins.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more shortly.
So always love weaving some leadership in. There was a great article in Fast Company. Brene Brown and Adam Grant say that the best leaders do this and mediocre managers do the opposite. And here's the punchline. Are you a learner or are you a knower? Which is very much, one of our core values here at TCN is the learning mode we talk about consistently. It's one thing talking about it, it's a whole nother thing trying to walk that walk. But how can you tell if someone's a great leader? They're in that learning mode versus that knowing mode. And really a great article kind of calling that out. And always love Brene as one of the things I look forward to over the holidays is, how many books do I read? And so I was actually a little bit of a slacker. The flu probably was part of that. Only read 5 this year, but that was one of the 5 was Brene's latest book, which my wife gave me for Christmas. Next one in hospice news, bipartisan senators say, keep hospice out of Medicare Advantage. 2 senators have penned a letter to congressional leadership urging them to oppose any measures to bring hospice reimbursement into Medicare Advantage. This was Roger Marshall from Kansas and Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island circulated a letter. So high five to both of them. That was right towards the end of November going into December. Another one, aging is changing. 3 truths that should reshape our strategies. This was in McKnight's, a really great article. I don't think it was one that was highly clicked on. We'll see when your stats in a couple moments. But truth number 1, aging is more active, self-directed, and personalized. Amen. The cognitive journey is blurred. Dementia inclusion must become a core operating principle. And number 3, the continuum is blurring, and senior living is becoming one of many choices. Of course, that builds off on one of the podcasts we had in the last year with Katie Smith-Sloan about senior living. But I thought that was a really great article about kind of future trends to be looking for in the aging area, which leads to another. McKnight's as well. AARP, 55% of family caregivers use tech to coordinate care. I thought that was really cool, and gets a little bit into my predictions a little bit later. I had a fascinating call with a longtime Studer family team member whenever we worked together at Studer, who is doing some cutting edge stuff. And the gist is this: people are choosing healthcare more and more based upon Google star ratings. Not going to CAPS, they're not going to CMS Compare. They're doing just like we do with all the other purchases that we actually do, as we look at more of those kind of Google star ratings. And the fact that people are using more tech to coordinate care, to me, this article kind of backed up some of that other data that we're seeing. Last thing, Cordt, and I'm going to hand it to you. I also wanted, since this was the last month of fiscal year 2025 or calendar year 25, I wanted to go back and just look through. So when I was prepping for this show, I went and read all of my summaries for last year, which, by the way, was pretty cool to do. First off, it was a great way for me to review the year. Also, it was a great way to kind of review, and this is a great resource for hospice and palliative care leaders. But there are 4 or 5 articles that to me were just a favorite, and maybe a little bit more of a omen or kind of a windsock to 2026. This was one, Becker's. 748 hospitals are at risk of closure, and it was a state-by-state report. That's not a happy article. It's one that concerns me. I know a lot of small communities where I grew up in South Louisiana, those critical access hospitals are one of the major employers in small town America. 748 hospitals is a big number. So that's going to be one we're going to want to watch. So that gets a little bit of a spoiler alert getting into my 2026. This was a good one in Forbes. This was back in May. 7 brutal truths about leadership that no one tells you at 29, which, by the way, I became a CEO the year after 29, the age of 30. And this was just, man, I felt like this is an article I wish I would have read when I was that young. But at 29, I was handed my first leadership role. 6 months later, I was drowning. Email problems, people quitting, morale, etc. And here were kind of the key points. Leadership is service, not authority. Postponed conversations become poisonous problems later on. In other words, don't kick the can down the road. And control suffocates innovation. So really one of the best leadership articles throughout the year. Here's another. This was in Technica. Should an AI copy of you, and this is cool that you guys pointed this one out, Cordt, because a lot of people would have missed this. Should an AI copy of you help decide if you live or die? Doctors share top concerns of AI surrogates aiding life or death decisions. But here's kind of a cool idea I had. Maybe I was delirious from the flu. But, there's really concerns about, AI, the Terminator movies. Maybe AI is, 30% chance. A lot of the smartest minds say, there's 30% chance that AI might basically do away with mankind. That's a pretty high percentage. I heard, I don't know if it was a podcast or an article again in the flu haze, I can't remember, but there was a 8% chance that when they did the atomic bomb, that it could have ignited all of the air and we could have actually died as a species. 8%. And they were really concerned about that when the whole Manhattan Project. There's a 30% chance that AI may do away with us. But here's my thought, Cordt. If we wanted to teach it not to do us harm, would it be kind of cool to use it in the ethicist side or in ethical wills and basically that whole kind of end of life planning, etc.? Could that be an interesting beachhead to solve some of these ethical dilemmas? It's just something that occurred to me. Again, it might have been in the flu haze, but I'm always felt like we have this beautiful platform of end of life care, and I've always felt like it's more impactful to what we do than maybe even what we think. Like for instance, Arnold Toynbee was a historian, studied all the civilizations in the history of man. And he said, one of the number one predictors of that civilization continued is what do they do for the old and the infirm, those who can't do for themselves. And I always thought, how cool is that? Like hospice, we're in the space that could determine if we continue as a civilization. And, our political climate, right and left, they can't agree on anything. But maybe we're like the common ground point that we should agree upon, because what you do for end-of-life care could determine the future of our civilization. And oh, by the way, maybe it's an interesting way to teach AI to let's live well with humans and not do away with us. So you could say that's maybe a little bit of a predictor.
It's a great reflection with that, Chris. And just a quick note that I think probably the strongest growth we're going to see in use of AI in the upcoming year is going to be around figuring out what AI does well, perhaps living wills, advanced care planning, some of that, pre-planning, and what it doesn't do so well. I think we would agree that we're not ready to have AI jumping in on decisions around life and death yet. It's a piece of information, but it has to be the person who's making the decision. And what a provocative thought.
Yeah, and think about feeding the data model. Like, well, Chris, you're 90 and you don't have any use for society, so we probably should pull the plug on you. Well, wait a minute, no, I still have this book in me. Like, feeding the data model might create some really interesting outcomes that maybe we didn't anticipate. And maybe I'm being too optimistic, but it was just a thought. Mm-hmm. All right. Couple more. Check. This was one I was really super stoked about. And I think it was we did top stories of October, but this traffic light care model that they use in England. So, quite often we do the pain scale, but the English model is they put the power in the hands of the patient. It says green, amber, red. In other words, where do you want to be? That then calibrates the pain scale. That to me was very profound, and I just didn't want us to miss that since it was one of the top news stories, again, in the month of October. This was in Digital Synopsis. Elderly people look at their younger reflections in this beautiful photo series by Tom Hussey. And I think you did an editor's note on this one. Every photo tells a story. Imagine just and I've been spending time with my father-in-law. He was here for my son's wedding. He's 91. It's pretty amazing. They drove from Florida for 8 hours. And here's a man who I just look at, he's still living life to the fullest. And picturing him looking at a younger picture of himself in that reflection, that to me is just such a deep picture and just a beautiful mission moment. So when I went back through all the articles for the year, I think this was back in July, that was just one that jumped out at me. And then here's one of the last ones, Cordt, and I'll hand it to you. The government, this was in November, the government shutdown showed why healthcare reform keeps failing. This was in Forbes by Rita Numeroff. Thank you for pointing it out. We did an editor's comment, and it was one of our top stories or top podcasts of last year, where Rita Numeroff literally held forth if RFK calls her, says, hey, Rita, if you would fix healthcare, how would you do it? And so it says there's going to be some interesting things. Again, we'll get in a second our predictions, but I think there's some things that are going to come to a head this year. I'm not sure the solutions are going to come forward this year, but I think at the beginning of the conversation, and that's an article that was pretty important. So what do you got?
A couple of quick thoughts before I jump into my summaries. One is you had commented on looking back at your summaries of 2025. And it reminded me that actually earlier this week, someone had asked me, what are some good articles about end-of-life care and AI? And rather than going to ChatGPT or going to Grok or going to Google and going to a medical library online kind of a resource, I went to our articles. We've run over 12,000 articles that have like 2 million reads now. And all of those 12,000 articles are specifically handpicked for hospice and palliative care. And so I went and searched our database of articles. And I'd love to say that, this is something Cordt, peeked behind the curtain and grabbed a database and did. No, if you're logged into our web page, which if you're receiving our emails, you have an account, your name and email, you can then access our search bar on the web page, and you can just put in whatever search term you want, and it will generate a list of all the articles we've run that include that term. And so it's a great kind of literature review resource of information. If you wanted top read articles or something, that's a different process. But if you're looking for information, it's already a curated database of information. So just a quick shout out to all the listeners that if you're looking for information on volunteers, advanced care planning, palliative care, symptom management, AI, I mean, what you can plug these terms in the search bar and uh, generate results of information that's already handpicked relevant for our field. So that was one thought. The other thought is you commented a couple of times on the editor notes. Dr. Joy Berger, our editor in chief, does a fantastic job with all of those editor notes. So I always like to give a shout out to Joy and put a spotlight on her for the great work that she does. Not only pulling most of the newsletter articles together, but her thoughtful comments on them. The occasional publisher note, that's me, like doing those. And so the shout outs that you were given earlier were all to Joy, and I just want to pass along my gratitude to her. As I jump in and take a look at the December articles and a reflection on 2025 as well, in terms of click-through rates, we published 261 articles in December that collectively received 93,000 reads. Notably, 22 stories surpassed 1,000 clicks each. And those are the general metrics that we're looking at on a month-to-month basis. Pretty typical results, particularly given holidays and people being out of the office. Our listeners know I've been using Dr. Ira Byock's recently published white paper, A Strategic Path Forward for Hospice and Palliative Care, as a framework to organize this month's most read articles. So he starts off addressing waste, fraud, and abuse. Zero tolerance. We have no room for this. And so I took a look back. We covered 9 regulatory stories in December focused on waste, fraud, and abuse. Just to lowlight 2 of them. One of them was 4 California residents sentenced to prison in connection with $16 million hospice fraud and money laundering scheme. I think we're going to see more and more of those kinds of articles, but want to make our listeners aware that while the speed of government may feel slow, often, maybe not always, but often those wheels of justice do turn, and we see results like this. The second article, Healthcare Fraud Enforcement Trends to Expect in 2026. Whenever I see an article like this, it's looking broadly across healthcare. The very first thing I do is a search for the word hospice. Like, is hospice in? And it is not. Second search, palliative care. It is not in this article, which I always find comfort in that, because we have had years where when you search the OIG, fraud investigation report for the word hospice, it has popped up as the number one topic on their radar. And it didn't, this was not an OIG report, but at least hospice and end of life care did not pop up on this trends to expect in 26 report. So that was some good news. So we do try to look at both sides of that coin. Jumping into Ira's 4 calls to action. The first one, clinical and programmatic standards. How do we distinguish between good and excellent care? We ran an article on interdisciplinary training to enhance home health clinician knowledge of palliative care. This was a journal article based on findings from the PIVOT, all caps there, an acronym, PIVOT pilot study. This had over 1,000 reads, and it was interesting because the largest increase in the study for the metrics they looked at was increased understanding of what palliative care services provide in the home health setting. So that was kind of cool. I love seeing some of the evidence-based practice, the journals that are putting forward best practices around this. His second pillar, making meaningful data readily available. A journal article that we ran in December really caught my eye. Validation of claims-based algorithm for specialist palliative care delivery and metastatic cancer. Wow, what a mouthful. And the article, it's a tough read, I'll be honest. It's very statistically dense. What I found really interesting in it was they found support for use of the palliative care specialty code, so that's specialty code 17, and support for the Encounter for Palliative Care code, the Z51.5 code, to identify provision of palliative care. And they nuance that, and it's kind of detailed. But there are 10 articles out there, including by some of the same authors of this article, that have said, nah, don't use the Z code to identify palliative care. We need to do a much better job of that, which is fine. We do need to do a better job of that. But here we're starting to see some research bubbling out saying, you know what, it's actually a pretty good marker. So I was encouraged by that, and like to see, testing of theories to see what comes out. The other article around the evidence base was bereavement service deserts. In 2024, a statewide assessment, this was in Michigan, of bereavement services was published in Death Studies. And the reason it caught my eye was I liked this statewide survey looking at a service desert, in this case, bereavement. But I really encourage listeners to take a look at that article and consider replicating it in your state. Maybe this has to do with bereavement service deserts. Maybe it's hospice service deserts, palliative care service deserts. They pulled together a nice methodology that could be replicated statewide or nationally. So a shout out to the folks that published this article and the way that they did their work on identifying, in this case, bereavement deserts. The third pillar in IRA's framework is driving competition based on quality. And Chris, I'm wondering for this, I saw the podcast, I listened to the podcast that you had with Andrew Reed, and he mentioned in that podcast, quality comes from within. And he noted that teams build sustainable systems and teach rigor with heart. When they do that, margin becomes a reliable barometer rather than the goal. And I'm wondering if you had thoughts on that or other takeaways from your discussion with Andrew.
Yeah, that was a fascinating podcast, and you just did a beautiful job of actually summarizing it, because that really was like whenever I was wrestling with what do we call it, and he suggested quality comes from within. I originally, when I wrote my book, The Anatomy of Leadership, and wrote the chapter on margin, I had Andrew in mind because he's always looked at numbers differently than most people. That's one reason why Andrew and I hit it off so well in my early days in hospice. And so he took that and he just kept unpeeling the onion in great, what I would call principles, philosophies. I think sometimes Andrew gets painted into a corner. Well, Andrew says that margins should be, high, basically. And he who has the best margins must be doing the best goal. And I think he clarified a lot of good stuff related to that. Also, I think sometimes, Andrew's such a eccentric guy. He's a rock star, literally, and he works in hospice, specific on the accounting side, which makes him a bit of a unicorn. And the fact that someone who is so kind of left brain and system and process would be a creative artist actually producing records, literally top 10 records. How the hell do you reconcile that? I'll leave that as a teaser because folks should go back. It really was one of our top listened to podcasts last year, but how he addressed that kind of quandary, if you will, and unpacked it and kind of clarified it. There were just so many pearls, but I think your summary is right on, that quality comes from within. Margin is a very interesting barometer. Doesn't mean win, lose, but barometer. There's always things that it can tell you. In fact, the analogy I use with him is I always talked about financials are like a CAT scan for the organization. I feel like he affirmed that, but I think took it much deeper.
Excellent. The other article that caught my eye in December was a podcast by Tom Maxwell titled The Future of the Hospice Physician, Hope, the Hope Tool, Staffing and Technology, and how these elements intertwine and impact hospice quality. The fourth pillar in IRA's framework, embracing and promoting our authentic brand. And we had two stories I wanted to highlight here. One, When the Nurse Becomes the Daughter, Lessons in My Father's Final Days, is a compelling story by Keisha Brown that she published in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care. A reminder that our work is both professional and yet deeply personal. Also, in December, we honored the legacies of Helen Donaldson, the former president and CEO of Hospice, and Glenna Hayhoy, founder of Avow Hospice, both who recently died. And it's interesting to me because this honoring the legacies kind of storyline that we started in the newsletter is consistently one of the most clicked on stories every month, and it's
Wow.
to me that's very encouraging that
is
we
encouraging.
are honoring our own. In terms of my category, I also had some thoughts around the hospice margins that you mentioned earlier. Maybe a little more pragmatically, we can talk about the 13.7% profit margin for for-profits and the negative 1.3% for nonprofits. I kind of look at that and say, this gap between nonprofits and for-profits, the amount of that gap has been pretty consistent year over year for several years. What caught my eye was not so much the gap, but the fact that both groups were about 5% lower margins compared to recent years.
Yep.
So that's going to be really interesting to track that and watch that. And that was Kim Newman's report from MedPAC, the December report, and that was quoting and based on 2023 data. So the 2024 information should be available soon, but we'll probably see it in the March MedPAC report to Congress. The other article that caught my eye and from my category was this conversation about AI and how it's being used in healthcare. And randomly, I was talking with some people about this, and I randomly Googled, how is CMS using AI? Because I was curious, and lo and behold, CMS has a webpage dedicated to this, and they outline all sorts of information and stuff about it. You had commented earlier about a project in half a dozen states using AI. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. I thought, well, if that wasn't top of mind for me, maybe that should be an article in the newsletter. So I popped it in the newsletter, had over 1,000 clicks, which I thought was interesting that other people are asking the same questions.
Don't miss out on the rest of this episode. We will be dropping that this Friday, January 16, 2026. Top news stories from 2025 and predictions for 2026 by Chris Comeaux and Cordt Kassner.